Dillon Danis absolutely sucks, and I think that we can all agree that we all feel the same way about him. The Dillon Danis that we know today is a massive embarrassment to MMA fans around the world, and in this video I'll be detailing how he became the stain that we can't seem to get rid of. Dillon did start from humble beginnings, as he received his black belt from Marcelo Garcia when Dillon was only 21 years old. Between 2015 and 2017, Dillon was competing as a pro, facing competition like Jake Shields, Gary Tonin, and even Gordon Ryan. The thing is though, Dillon just wasn't as good as many of the true top BJJ athletes in the world. His record at his career's end was 18-16, definitely not anything to write home about. In fact, compared to his peers, it's pretty safe to say that Dillon was actually pretty damn mediocre at jiu-jitsu and not anywhere close to being the best of the best. However, fortunately for Dillon, it was during this time that in 2016, Conor McGregor sought out Dillon and brought him into his camp. It's important to remember where Conor was at this time. He was coming off his first defeat since becoming a superstar, losing to Nate Diaz in a stunning upset. Conor then went on a warpath for redemption after his jiu-jitsu was exposed as a weakness, and to fix this, he brought Dillon into the fold. And again, fortunately for Dillon, what he lacked in wins over big names, he made up for with his brash attitude and his personal connection with Conor. And as a result, Dillon quickly became an integral part of Conor's team. As we know, Conor famously wins the rematch, using next to none of the BJJ he worked on with Dillon, but that didn't matter for Danis because being friends with McGregor catapulted Dillon into being a star in combat sports. Just 2 days after Conor's victory over Nate at UFC 202, Dillon appeared on Ariel Helwani's MMA Hour for an hour-plus long interview. Like, this is pretty crazy to think about knowing what we know of Dillon now. Before the Conor-Nate 2 fight, Dillon was legitimately unknown to almost all MMA fans, but because Dillon was brought into Conor's camp for just one fight, he was now landing hour-long interviews on the biggest MMA show in the entire world. I guess it kind of makes sense though. At this point in time, the entire world seemed to belong to Conor McGregor, and the fact that Dillon was one of his most trusted cohorts meant that Dillon became a celebrity quite literally overnight. It was also at this time that Dillon's personal style noticeably began to parrot Conor's. From the pictures that he posted to the clothes that he wore, it was really obvious that Dillon enjoyed the Conor McGregor shine and wanted more of it. And I honestly remember finding this to be extremely cringy and pathetic. Like, there's definitely nothing wrong with becoming famous through his association with Conor. In a lot of ways, it's almost inevitable that it would happen. But it's a totally different story when Dillon would straight up copy Conor's style in every way, shape, and form in order to get attention. Like, bro, there's a clear line between wanting to be friends with Conor versus wanting to be Conor, and by this point in time, it's obvious that Dillon had become addicted to the spotlight. Dillon remained a part of Team Conor for the Eddie Alvarez fight, and as we all know, this would be Conor's crowning achievement in the sport of mixed martial arts and his single best performance in the UFC. Conor won in glorious fashion, and Dillon's self-described best friend was now the UFC's first champ, and as you can probably imagine, Dillon became even more famous by association for being a part of Team Conor. You would think that Dillon was on top of the world, and he was for about 2 months, before he was hit by some surprise news. Marcelo Garcia, his longtime coach, publicly disassociated himself and his gym from Dillon. He expressed in his announcement his disapproval of Dillon's lifestyle and behavior since becoming famous. He mentioned Dillon's social media activities specifically as irritating, and in a 2023 podcast appearance on Andrew Schultz's Flagrant, Dillon said the following.
Oh, yeah, but you know what? Okay, there's difference though. Because if he would have just suspended me and my friend Munch at the time, right? Unpublicly, but then he went and made a video and did it outside. What's that like line? You don't discipline your kids in public.
Yeah. And from what I've read of Dillon and Marcelo, it seems like Dillon really looked up to Marcelo as a father figure. To have that relationship for many years end in the manner that it did understandably hurt him a lot. And I genuinely believe that this experience is what started Dillon's current villain arc that he's been on today. Prior, we never really saw Dillon get into trouble or even really start trouble with the people around him. I mean, he and Nate talked a little bit of shit at each other, but that's really all that it was. But after getting suspended from Marcelo's gym, we really saw the Dillon we know today start to take shape. It would also be around this time that Dillon signs with Bellator MMA, despite having zero MMA experience. It's obvious that Bellator signed Dillon just on name value alone because it wasn't based on any fighting merit, that's for sure. And just like how a bad stand-up comedian who's friends with Joe Rogan will fall into undeserved opportunities, the same can be said about friends of Conor McGregor in MMA. Dillon's MMA career, if you can even call it that, never picked up steam. I mean, it barely barely even left the station. Despite being signed as a Bellator fighter for over 6 years, Dillon only fought twice. And I guess, to his credit, he went 2-0, but both of his opponents are so unknown that neither of them even have Wikipedia pages. Both of Dillon's fights in Bellator did not look good at all, especially in the striking department. Despite totally coincidentally coming out with a similar stance and style as Conor, Dillon noticeably looked uncomfortable on the feet, and he blocked punches with his face until he was able to get the fights to the ground, where he relied on his lifeline of jiu-jitsu to finish the fights. And we can only guess why Dillon never stepped back into a cage, despite constantly stating that he was going to make a return. But if you're asking for my guess, then I'd guess it's because he knew that he just wasn't very good at MMA. And after several years of crying wolf and saying that he's going to fight again, Bellator would eventually cut him from the roster for inactivity. It was in between his 2 Bellator fights that Dillon began making his first mainstream headlines, but for all of the wrong reasons. Heading into UFC 229, Dillon, despite being officially in a coaching role, became an extension of Conor's uncomfortably mean-spirited, line-crossing build-up to the Khabib fight. Of course, there was the infamous dolly throwing incident, which Dillon said he helped pay Conor's bail for. Then there were the pre-fight social media posts, Dillon showing images where Khabib appears to drink alcohol against his Muslim faith. According to Dillon himself, Ali Abdelaziz messaged and even threatened Dillon because of these posts. Now, in my opinion, even if you think Conor was within his right to stir up this level of controversy heading into the Khabib fight, I feel like Dillon joining in and adding to the shit talk is pretty lame. Like, it's one thing for fighters to talk shit to each other, whether it be to promote the fight or not, but it seems kinda pathetic that Dillon, who was supposed to be in a coaching role for Conor, partook in the personal insults towards Khabib and his team as well. And I get it, they're friends or whatever, but it really just seems like Dillon was doing all that he could to appease his daddy Conor and stay in his good graces. Not only that, Dillon seemingly carried the shit talk from online into the corner as well. A bystander to the octagon at UFC 229 said Danis was calling Khabib a fucking Muslim rat. Danis denies this, and Khabib himself claims he couldn't hear anything in the ring. Whatever the case may be, it would be Dillon who Khabib initially flew out of the octagon to attack in the infamous UFC 229 brawl. The brawl, which made headlines worldwide, became a shadow that followed all involved, including and maybe especially Dillon. But whereas most people would feel embarrassment or shame for being a part of such a controversial moment, Dillon didn't seem to feel that way. In fact, it was his biggest moment in the limelight yet. It didn't matter for what. Dillon was just happy to be there, having his name attached to such a historic moment. And for Dillon, UFC 229 taught him what people responded to. Religion, family, stereotypes, anything was on the table. We wouldn't hear from Dillon again until September of 2021, when Dillon was arrested following an altercation with a bouncer outside of a New Jersey bar. In a very famous video, Dillon can clearly be seen being held and subdued in a chokehold by the bar security. Danis claimed that this was a misunderstanding and that officers released him after about 20 minutes, but like, isn't it a little embarrassing that Dillon Danis, someone who touts himself as an elite grappler, got manhandled, controlled, and choked by a random security guard at a bar? If I was Conor McGregor and I saw these clips of my jiu-jitsu coach getting dominated by bar security, I'd really be reconsidering who I look to for grappling advice. Anyways, remember this bouncer, his name is Chance. He'll be coming up again shortly. It wasn't even 2 weeks later before Dillon appeared on the MMA Hour once again, following what was, for him, an extended public silence after his arrest. And, for whatever reason, Dillon decided that now would be an opportune time to mention that MMA legend and his former opponent, Jake Shields, allegedly offered him steroids before the 2017 ADCC competition. And look, although I totally believe that Jake Shields knowingly uses steroids for his jiu-jitsu competitions, this really feels like a way for Dillon to distract people from his humiliating defeat at the hands of Chance the Bouncer not even 2 weeks ago. Not only that, do I think it's at all a coincidence that he's accusing this of Jake Shields, who's been a lifelong friend and training partner of Nate Diaz. So even though I totally don't doubt that Jake Shields is a career-long steroid cheat, I really get the feeling that this is Dillon Danis trying to do all that he can to get people to forget he was submitted by a security guard. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Dillon became involved in an influencer boxing event when he was slated to fight against YouTuber KSI in January of 2023. Things got genuinely heated between these two, with both men hurling insults at not just each other but at each other's mom. Not only that, Dillon also incited a brawl during a promotional press conference for the fight in the weeks leading up to the event after he threw a punch at KSI while on camera. However, despite all of the bad blood and the antics by Dillon, just 10 days before the fight, Dillon pulled out, stating he was underprepared, has no coach, and was struggling to make the weight. And honestly, this is so utterly pathetic from Dillon, and it really shows what kind of person he's turned into since becoming addicted to the fame. This guy signed on the dotted line to fight a YouTuber, KSI, and after weeks of talking talking shit and instigating brawls, he was too scared to actually meet him in the ring. Like, what so-called professional fighter would bitch out of a fight with a literal YouTuber like this? Dillon has competed at the highest levels of jiu-jitsu and even had 2 Bellator fights, but he was so afraid of losing to KSI that he never even bothered to actually train. And not only that, I'm sure that Dillon knew all along that he was going to pull out of the fight and never bothered to prepare for it. So fucking sad. It would only be a few months until his next fight was announced, and honestly, I'm surprised that Dillon was even given an opportunity to fight again after pulling out of the KSI fight. This time around, Dillon Danis was signed to face American YouTuber Logan Paul in Manchester, England. In the build-up to his fight with Logan, Dillon began posting a now infamous onslaught of constant poking and prodding aimed squarely at Logan Paul's fiancée, Nina Agdal. Nina, who is a famous Danish model, has many celebrity exes, and that seemingly was enough for Dillon to turn this fight into a full-blown propaganda campaign to both irritate Logan and generate buzz for himself and the fight. In Dillon's mind, this justifies not only constantly posting about another man's fiancé, but even going as far to share her nude photos against her will to his millions of followers. And personally, I really feel like Dillon crossed a line in doing this, but Nina not only ended up filing a restraining order against Dillon, but she also has filed a revenge porn lawsuit against Danis for distributing nude photos of her online against her will. As a means to troll Dillon back, Logan sought out and found Chance, the same security guard that had choked out Dillon 2 years prior. There's a video of Logan threatening Dillon that if Dillon were to pull any similar antics like he did during his KSI fight buildup, then he would have to answer to Chance. And you know what? As much as it pains me to give any props to Logan Paul for anything, I'd say that what Logan does to Dillon here is so much more of a creative and effective means of insulting an opponent than Dillon attacking Logan's fiancé. Imagine being outdone in fight promotion to Logan Paul. This time around, however, Dillon actually does make it to the ring, and let's just say that it was clear from the opening seconds of the fight that quote-unquote professional fighter Dillon Danis was the far inferior fighter. With a completely impossible to understand game plan, Dillon barely threw any punches the entire fight and seemingly just focused on trying to clinch with Logan. In the final round of the fight, Dillon threw his Hail Mary, and you might remember that just months prior to this, Nate Diaz had, in his own mind, defeated Jake Paul, Logan Paul's younger brother, via guillotine choke in their own boxing fight. So, Dillon, being a genius and a super original guy, decided to copy Nate by going for a guillotine choke of his own. Except, unlike Nate, Logan easily threw Dillon off of him, and while Dillon was flat on his back in the ring, Logan punched Dillon square in the face. And because of this buffoonery, Dillon would officially lose for unsportsmanlike conduct in the 6th and final round. And after getting utterly embarrassed by a YouTuber, Logan Paul, you might think that Dillon might have learned some lesson about humility or the value of relating to other humans, or even that he didn't need this kind of negativity to generate interest in him. You would be wrong. Because not long after the Logan fight, Misfits Boxing asked Paige Van Sant about MMA fighters transitioning to boxing, specifically inquiring about Dillon Danis. Before they could finish the question, she laughed at the notion that Dillon was a quote real fighter and corrected the interviewer, saying that Dillon was not a real fighter at all. In response to this, Dillon took to Twitter and claimed Paige was only mad that he didn't quote wife her and threatened to quote ruin her marriage by telling the world about his 2 trips to Vegas to see her. I would like to let Paige cook here because she says in response,
"The only time I remember ever seeing you in Vegas was at the UFC athlete retreat. You walked up to me in a bar, asked me to peg you in front of multiple other UFC fighters, and I laughed in your face."
Dillon, not to be outdone, responds to Paige, saying, "You must have forgotten why I asked you to peg me because that stank pussy filled the room from all the alpha male gym members who've nutted in you." Like, does Dillon actually think that he did something here? Does he actually think that he proved a point by saying this? And I can't help but notice that Dillon fully admits to asking Paige to peg him. Now, in terms of non-combat related controversies, Dillon has also been outed as a promoter of numerous cryptocurrency scams. In fact, famous YouTuber CoffeeZilla has a 15-minute video where he tricks Dillon into agreeing to promote a fake cryptocurrency, and the ironic thing about this is that during this time, Dillon was attacking Logan Paul on Twitter for Logan's involvement in the famous CryptoZoo scam. I really recommend that you watch CoffeeZilla's video on this yourself because you'll really see how little Dillon actually cared about making sure this was not a scam before he started promoting it. CoffeeZilla even made a website that you can still visit to this day that details all of the fake NFTs that Dillon promoted to his fans. So not only is Dillon Dillon a fake-ass fighter, he's also an idiot and a hypocrite. This guy talked so much shit to Logan for being involved in a massive crypto scam while he was quite literally doing the same exact stuff. And up to now, this is the story of Dillon Danis. This is the story of a guy who came from humble beginnings and entered martial arts with the sincere intentions of testing his skills against the best in the world. This is the story of a guy who, when given the slightest bit of attention and fame, became addicted to it and has since done all that he can to cling on to the smallest scraps of relevancy that he has left. And since he was first introduced to the MMA world by way of Conor McGregor, Dillon has abandoned any shred of dignity that he may have had in exchange for an insatiable desire to remain in the public eye, no matter the cost. Dillon might have started off his martial arts career as a genuine competitor. This much might be true. However, I really think that after Dillon was faced with the truth that he was nothing more than a mediocre jiu-jitsu athlete and thereafter a lackluster MMA fighter, Dillon then put his sense of shame to the side and has desperately clung to his C-list level of fame however he can. Somehow, despite being a mediocre at best jiu-jitsu athlete, he was given the golden opportunity to work with Conor McGregor. And through his relationship with Conor, he was given another golden opportunity to make a name for himself as a pro mixed martial arts fighter where he would only fight twice and then abandon legitimate competition forever. And yet, in spite of his unimpressive athletic career, Dillon is a person that MMA fans can't seem to get rid of, because whenever it seems like Dillon has faded back into obscurity, he'll find a way back into news headlines by starting a new beef or controversy in some way or another. There was a very brief time in the beginning where Dillon was famous because of merit, or at least we thought it was merit. And for a little bit there, many fans, including myself, thought that Dillon was going to make waves in the world of MMA either as Conor's coach or he would forge his own path as an MMA fighter. Dillon really did take the easy way out. Instead of becoming a respectable coach, Dillon decided to not only ride Conor's coattails, but also became a yes man to the guy who made him famous. And instead of pursuing a legitimate career as an MMA fighter, Dillon fought 2 lackluster fights and eventually retired due to inactivity. And instead of just being a simple positive influence in the world of MMA and combat sports as a whole, Dillon has become an utter laughingstock to those he once considered his peers, with real fighters openly ridiculing him and even assaulting him in public due to his online antics. He's become such a joke in the world of real combat sports that his only avenue for competition these days is losing to YouTubers in influencer boxing events. The sad thing about Dillon is that it's clear that he doesn't care anymore about being a legitimate martial artist. He doesn't care that most people know that he's a fraud and he's seen as a joke amongst anybody who's paying attention. Dillon's sense of self has become so warped by the fame he gained since becoming friends with Conor that he's become addicted to the attention of the internet, even if it comes at the cost of his dignity. And you know what? I think the saddest thing about Dillon to me is that he knows he can't back up any of his bluster and shit talk, yet he continues to pretend like he was ever a legit fighter. A legit fighter wouldn't stop competing in MMA after 2 fights where he was set up to win. A legit fighter wouldn't run away scared from YouTuber KSI just 10 days before they were supposed to fight. A legit fighter wouldn't put on such a piss poor display against Logan Paul only to fail going for a guillotine and getting popped in the face while on his back and his legs up in the air. Dillon is by far, in a ways, the saddest person that the sport of jiu-jitsu and MMA has ever produced. He's not the worst person, no, but he's for sure the most pathetic excuse of a fighter that I have personally ever seen. And as it goes in this world, the more desperate and pathetic a person acts, the more attention that they'll receive. And the Dillon Danis of today has mastered the art of behaving like such a doofus to the point where we're all forced to turn our heads and look at his miserable attempts for us to acknowledge that he still exists. I'm really wondering when the next time Dillon's going to pop back up in the news cycle for another installment of his childish behavior, but I'll say this, it's only a matter of time.